In the spring of 1993, the Grayson family, 2 parents, 2 children, left their home for what was supposed to be a short trip across town. Their house was neat, the beds made, dinner plates still drying by the sink. They never returned. Days became weeks, weeks into months, and not a trace was found. No ransom, no wreck, no reason. How can a whole family vanish, not into danger, but into silence? On the north side of town stood a small white house with a maple tree out front and a wooden swing that creaked in the wind. The Graysons lived there: Gabe, his wife Nora, and their 2 children, Cyrus and Ellie. Gabe was a technician for the power company, known for being steady and polite. He fixed his neighbor's light switches without ever asking for payment. Nora, 37, worked from home, doing bookkeeping for a local feed store. She kept the house in quiet order, always with the faint smell of coffee and laundry soap in the air. Their children were part of the town, in that natural way small-town kids are. Cyrus played baseball every Saturday, and Ellie drew pictures for the church bulletin board. They were ordinary people, and maybe that's why everyone remembered them so clearly later. The Graysons didn't have enemies. They didn't have problems that anyone could see. But those who looked back would recall that, in the months before the spring of '93, Gabe had begun to look tired. He stayed later at work. Nora made a few unplanned trips to the bank. And once, the next-door neighbor heard them talking in low voices on the porch long after midnight. Still, nothing seemed serious enough to cause worry. On the morning of April 15th, the sun rose pale over the valley. A light wind moved the curtains in the Grayson home. At around 9, Gabe called his parents in Fresno and told them he was taking Nora and the kids for a short trip north. "Just a few days away," he said. His voice, according to his father, was calm, though unusually firm. Nora was seen later hanging laundry, talking with a neighbor, saying they'd be back before Monday. That afternoon, around 4:30, the neighbor across the street saw Gabe carrying 2 suitcases and a blue cooler to the back of his silver Ford F-150 pickup. Nora locked the front door, checked the handle twice, then helped Ellie buckle into the back seat. Cyrus climbed in beside her, holding his baseball glove. Gabe started the engine, waved once toward the porch, and the truck rolled down North County Road, turning right toward the main highway. The sound of the engine faded. The neighbor thought nothing of it. Families left for weekend trips all the time. The swing on the porch moved a little in the warm breeze. The curtains in the front window fluttered once and stilled. By sunset, the house stood quiet. The next morning, the paper lay untouched in the driveway. And by the end of that week, the Graysons had missed work, calls went unanswered, and no one in. Visalia could say where they had gone. From that day on, no one ever saw Gabe, Nora, Cyrus, or little Ellie again. The first days after the Graysons left were filled with the kind of silence that doesn't seem strange until it lasts too long. The White House on North County Road stayed dark at night. No porch light, no television glow. The mail piled up in the box, and the newspaper boy stopped tossing papers when the porch steps began to gather dust. It was the neighbor, Mrs. Langford, who first grew uneasy. On the 5th morning after they'd driven off, she saw the curtains still drawn and the trash cans still lined neatly by the fence. They'd never miss pickup day, she told police later. Not Gabe. He kept a schedule like clockwork. When she knocked, there was no answer. She walked around back, calling Nora's name, but all she heard was the faint hum of bees in the garden. She waited another day, then phoned Gabe's parents in Fresno. They hadn't heard from him either. By the next afternoon, the police had been called. Detective Sergeant Paul Adler from the Visalia Police Department was the first to step into the house. He would later say the thing he remembered most was the stillness. "It wasn't like a burglary," he told reporters years later. "It was like time had stopped at 4 o'clock that afternoon. The living room was tidy, the couch cushions lined straight, a family photo of the four of them above the mantel. The kitchen smelled faintly of old coffee. On the table sat a plate with a single apple gone soft, a folded grocery list, and Nora's handwriting across a notepad. Laundry detergent, cat food, batteries. The cat was gone too. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks or footprints in the yard. The beds were made, clothes hung neatly in the closets, but half of Gabe's shirts were missing, as were a few of Nora's dresses. The children's rooms were almost untouched. Ellie's crayons scattered across her desk, a picture of the family taped to the wall beside her bed. Adler found an open wall calendar near the refrigerator. The date, April 15th, was circled in red ink, but there was no explanation beside it. In the small office space off the kitchen, Nora's accounting papers were stacked neatly, her checkbook balanced to the cent. There were no overdue bills, no debt notices, nothing to hint at panic or flight. The truck was gone, of course, the silver Ford F-150 with a cracked taillight. The garage was otherwise clean, except for a missing set of wrenches and an empty gas can. When Adler stepped back out into the yard, the evening sun was falling behind the fields. He looked toward the narrow road that led north and thought of the simplest question a detective can ask. If they planned to come back, why take everything that mattered and nothing else? The following morning, the department classified the case as a missing persons investigation. Flyers went up around Visalia, and the Grayson photo was printed in the local paper. 4 smiling faces in a church portrait, taken just 6 months earlier. At first there was optimism. Families disappear sometimes. A trip gone wrong, a car breakdown, even a quiet argument that ends with someone driving until they've calmed down. But days turned to weeks, and there were no calls, no bank activity, no hospital records, no sightings. Adler requested assistance from the California Highway Patrol to check every accident report within a 200-mile radius. Nothing matched. The truck's license plate, 5H7329, never appeared on any toll or gas station camera. It was as if it had left the grid entirely after that last sighting on North County Road. By the second week, the case grew larger than the small-town station could manage. The Tulare County Sheriff's Office joined in, along with volunteers from a local search and rescue team. Helicopters flew over the surrounding farmland, scanning the irrigation canals, the foothills near Sequoia National Park, and the dried riverbeds that sometimes hid wrecks for years. They found old car frames, rusted bicycles, and the remains of a cow that had wandered too far. But no trace of a silver Ford. Inside the police station, Detective Adler set up a board. The family photo, a hand-drawn map of their last known route, bank statements pinned beside it. The last withdrawal from Gabe's account was made at a small ATM on Mooney Boulevard the day before they left, $8,000 in cash. Nora's account was emptied the same morning. No one had noticed it at the time. When the bank manager confirmed the transactions, he remembered Nora being quiet but polite. Nothing in her demeanor suggested distress. She even smiled when he handed her the receipt. Adler began interviewing people who knew the family: co-workers, the children's teachers, the pastor at the local church. Everyone said the same thing. They were good people, private but kind. No marital trouble, no police calls to the house. The perfect family, the pastor said. But sometimes perfect families are the ones who never say when something's wrong. Theories began to surface. One officer suggested Gabe might have debts. Gambling, maybe. Another thought Nora had been planning to leave, and Gabe simply went with her. A third, the most whispered version, hinted that something terrible had happened, and they were buried somewhere out in the orchards. The department checked every lead. A farmer reported a strange smell near his irrigation ditch. Turned out to be a dead coyote. A truck driver swore he'd seen a woman and 2 kids matching their description near Bakersfield. The diner owner said otherwise. Each rumor led nowhere. As summer came, the case began to feel heavier. The missing posters curled at the corners, sun-bleached by the heat. The neighbors cut the Grayson lawn for a while, then stopped. The swing on the porch grew still under, a thin film of dust. Gabe's parents drove from Fresno every other weekend to speak with the detectives. His father, Harold, brought coffee and always asked the same question. "You're sure they didn't crash somewhere out there?" Adler would shake his head. "We've checked every ravine." By late June, the department filed its first progress report. No signs of foul play. No ransom. Family appears to have left voluntarily. It was the kind of statement that satisfied paperwork, but not the people who loved them. Then, in early July, a faint lead surfaced. A used car lot in Bakersfield reported buying a Ford F-150 Silver, matching the plate number. The dealer said the seller was a man in his 30s who paid cash for a trade-in. No questions asked. The bill of sale was dated April 16th, one day after the Graysons left. The man's name on the document was G. Grayson. The signature matched. When the papers arrived in Visalia, Adler sat at his desk a long time before saying anything. He called Gabe's father into the station and showed him the copy. "That's his handwriting," Harold said quietly. "That's my boy." It should have been relief, but instead it left them with more questions. If Gabe sold the truck, where did he go next? Why did he take his family without telling anyone? Why cut off all contact? The car lot owner was questioned in detail. He remembered the man clearly, tall, calm, polite, wearing a ball cap. The transaction was clean. "Didn't seem scared," the dealer said. "Didn't seem like a man running." He handed over a receipt, $4,200 in cash. From that moment, the case began to change shape. It was no longer about people lost against their will. It was about people who might have chosen to disappear. Still, Adler wasn't convinced. He ordered the vehicle impounded and checked for prints. The only ones found belonged to Gabe and Nora. No strangers, no sign of a struggle inside. The truck had been cleaned, but not perfectly. There were still a few grains of sand in the floor mats, dust from the valley roads. It told him only that they had driven far enough to cross the dry belt of Central California. After that, the trail ended. By August, the local paper had run the story 4 times, each one shorter than the last. The first headline read, "Family of 4 missing after weekend trip." The last one simply said, "No new leads in Grayson case." The townspeople had begun to move on, though some still lowered their voices when passing the empty house. For Adler, the file remained on his desk long after the news had faded. Some nights, when the station was quiet, he'd reopen it and stare at the last photo of them. Gabe with his arm around Nora, both children grinning, a normal life caught seconds before it vanished. He wrote one note on the inside cover of the case binder before closing it again. They didn't disappear in the dark. They drove away in daylight. Maybe that's why it's so hard to find where they went. The Grayson case stayed open, but by autumn there was little left to search. The fields around Visalia turned gold again, the heat settled, and the white house with the swing remained empty, a shell waiting for someone who would never return. And in that town where nothing much ever changed, people learned something new. Sometimes disappearance doesn't happen in the woods or on the highway. Sometimes it starts in a perfectly ordinary home, on a perfectly ordinary day, when a family decides without warning that they no longer belong to the life they built. By the time autumn settled over Visalia, the Grayson house no longer looked like it belonged to anyone. Dust had gathered on the windowsills, and the grass out front grew in uneven patches. Someone, maybe a kind neighbor, maybe Gabe's father, left fresh flowers by the porch once a month, but they withered quickly in the valley heat. The family that had once filled that small white house had been gone for half a year, and the silence they left behind was beginning to feel permanent. Detective Paul Adler still kept their file on his desk. It wasn't standard procedure. Missing person cases without evidence of a crime were usually filed away after 90 days. But something about this one stayed with him. He told his partner it was the normalcy that bothered him. "People vanish when there's chaos," he said. "But this family left clean, like they planned it down to the minute." Every few weeks, he revisited the case. He'd call the banks, check Social Security records, even talk to the post office in case someone forwarded their mail. Nothing. The Graysons' names never appeared again. No new addresses, no driver's license renewals, no tax filings. It was as if the entire family had stepped outside the system and closed the door behind them. In December 1993, 9 months after the disappearance, Gabe's parents came to the station carrying a box of photographs. They asked Adler to keep it, in case one day someone needed them for identification. Inside were school pictures of the children, snapshots from camping trips, Nora smiling in the kitchen with flour on her hands. Adler placed the box on top of the evidence cabinet, next to a stack of reports that hadn't been opened in months. That winter, the case finally cooled. The department didn't close it, but no one expected movement anymore. The truck sale had been confirmed, and the transaction was legal. There was no insurance claim, no sign of fraud. Everything pointed to one quiet conclusion. They had left by choice. Still, the question of why gnawed at people. Rumors took root in a town that had nothing else to talk about. Some said Gabe had gotten mixed up in bad investments. Others whispered that Nora had grown restless and pulled him along. One wild story claimed they'd joined a religious group somewhere in the northern mountains. None of it fit what anyone knew of them. They weren't the kind of people to run or to reinvent themselves. In January 1994, a call came in from a retired truck driver in Redding, nearly 400 miles north. He thought he'd seen a man resembling Gabe at a rest stop along Interstate 5. The man was filling up an old blue van with Oregon plates, 2 kids sleeping in the back. "He looked right at me," the driver said, "but it was like he didn't recognize me, or pretended not to." When officers followed up, the van was gone. The security camera at the gas station was broken that night, and there was nothing more to chase. The following month, Nora's sister wrote a letter to the Visalia Times-Delta, asking anyone with information to come forward. The paper printed it on page 4, beside an ad for used farm equipment. She wrote, "We just want to know they're alive. We don't need explanations." No one replied. Through the spring, Adler began to see the Grayson file as more than a case. It became a kind of mirror, reflecting the lives people lead without really being seen. "You can live beside someone for years," he said later, "and never know what's happening behind their front door." He reviewed the photos again that May, the anniversary of the day they left. In one, Gabe was teaching Cyrus to throw a baseball. In another, Ellie sat on the porch with her mother, their hair caught by the same wind that now moved through an empty yard. He thought of the neighbor who'd waved as the truck drove away. One small wave. That was the last human contact they'd had with the world they left behind. By mid-1994, the local paper stopped mentioning the case. The town adjusted, as towns do. New families moved in. Children grew up. The Graysons became a name people remembered vaguely, the kind of story mentioned over coffee when the weather turned hot again. But for those who had known them closely, the questions lingered. Gabe's father still drove the old route between Fresno and Visalia every Sunday, slowing down as he passed the empty house. He would park across the street for a few minutes, engine running, and stare at the porch. "If he came back," he told Adler once, "I'd forgive everything. I just want to hear his voice again." There were no new leads, only the same quiet facts, repeated so often they began to lose meaning. They left on April 15th. The truck was sold the next day. Their accounts were emptied. No one saw them again. And yet, Adler couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. Too many things were almost answers. The circled date on the calendar, the missing shirts, the quiet tone in Gabe's last phone call. He started to think of the Graysons not as victims, but as people in transit. "They weren't lost," he wrote in his private notes. "They were going somewhere." In early July, 15 months after the day they left, something finally shifted. A call came through the station from an operator in Santa Rosa, a city far to the north. It was a payphone, the voice faint, a woman speaking quietly. The words were simple, but they froze the room. "The Grayson family is alive. They don't want to be found." The line clicked dead. Adler and 2 officers drove to Santa Rosa that same evening. They found the payphone outside a small grocery store, the handset still dangling. In the metal coin tray was a receipt from a nearby gas station, time-stamped only 30 minutes before the call. Forensics dusted the phone and found a partial fingerprint. It matched Nora Grayson. When Adler received the report, he read it twice. The print was clean, fresh, impossible to mistake. After 15 months, it was the first real sign of life. He didn't know what to tell the family. That night, he sat in his office, the lights dim, the ceiling fan turning slow above him. On the wall, the photo of the 4 smiling faces still hung where it always had. For the first time, the silence around the case didn't feel hopeless. It felt deliberate, as though somewhere out there, the Graysons had chosen to live a different kind of life, one that left no forwarding address. Still, in his report, Adler wrote only one line to close the update. "Confirmed contact, alive, but unwilling to engage." And beneath that, almost like a question meant for no one but himself. If a disappearance is voluntary, does it still count as being missing? The case file grew quiet again, but not forgotten. The story of the Graysons was no longer about loss. It was about choice. A choice made on a clear April afternoon in 1993, on a road leading out of Visalia, with the sound of a pickup fading into the wind. 2 days after the mysterious phone call from Santa Rosa, a plain envelope arrived at the post office in Fresno. It carried no return address, only the name Harold Grayson typed neatly in black ink. The postmark was faint, blurred by moisture, but the first 2 digits of the zip code matched Northern California. Harold collected his mail that morning the way he always did. Slow, deliberate, sorting the bills from the advertisements. He didn't open the envelope right away. It wasn't until after lunch, sitting at his kitchen table with the radio low, that he reached for a knife and slit the seal. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. The image was slightly overexposed, the edges pale, but the faces were clear. It was his son, Gabe, standing beside Nora in front of what looked like a small trailer home with faded blue siding. Behind them, 2 children, Cyrus and Ellie, squinted into the sun. All 4 were smiling. In the lower corner, someone had written in blue pen, "We're fine. Please don't look for us." Harold froze. He stared at the picture for a long time, the steady hum of the refrigerator behind him. Then he called his wife, Marion, into the room. When she saw it, she covered her mouth with both hands. "It's them," she whispered. "It's really them." Within the hour, they were on the phone with Detective Paul Adler. He drove up that same evening, taking the photograph carefully by its edges, as if afraid to disturb what little truth it held. The image was handed over to the department's forensic unit the next day. Under magnification, the photo revealed small details. A license plate partly visible on a car parked behind the trailer, blurred numbers ending in 67B, a newspaper folded on a step, dated May 1994, just weeks earlier. The handwriting on the back matched Nora's, confirmed by comparison with her notes found in the Visalia home. The Polaroid paper was traced to a batch manufactured that same spring. "They're alive," Adler said quietly during the briefing, "and they don't want to be found." It was the first time in 15 months that the case file gained a new page. Yet the photo didn't bring closure. It brought confusion. For the department, it meant the disappearance wasn't a crime. For the Grayson parents, it meant their son was out there, somewhere, choosing silence over family. Adler drove to Fresno again that weekend. He sat with Harold and Marion at their kitchen table as they examined the picture under the yellow light. "Do you see anything you recognize?" he asked. Harold leaned close, tracing the faint outline of a tree in the background. "Looks like an oak. Not like the ones around here? Maybe up north, maybe Oregon?" Marion shook her head. "Why would they do this? Why send us this if they don't want to be found?" Adler didn't answer. He knew there were many reasons people vanished. Fear, debt, shame, sometimes even the simple exhaustion of a life that no longer felt like their own. But looking at that photograph, the smiles that seemed slightly too careful, the sunlight too bright, he wondered whether the Graysons were hiding from someone else, or from the memory of who they'd been. News of the photo never reached the papers. At the family's request, the department kept it confidential, classifying the case as voluntary disappearance, confirmed contact. Inside the station, officers who'd once called the case the Visalia vanishing now referred to it simply as the Graysons. No one asked many questions. Still, the picture circulated quietly among a few detectives, each forming their own theories. One thought Gabe had taken the family off the grid to escape debt collectors. Another believed Nora had convinced him to start over somewhere under new names. A third, younger officer wondered if they'd joined a community that lived cash only, disconnected from modern systems. In those years, such enclaves existed in the northern states, places where people could vanish into the woods and never file another tax form again. Adler kept returning to one detail: the car behind the trailer. He sent inquiries to the DMV in 3 states, but partial plates gave no match. The terrain visible behind them suggested somewhere inland, not coastal. Dry grass, scattered pines, a low hill behind the lot. It could have been anywhere between Redding and the Oregon border. He even sent copies of the photo to the FBI's Missing Persons Division, but without evidence of a crime, they declined to pursue it further. Harold, however, refused to let it rest. Each month, he mailed copies of the photograph to small-town police departments across Northern California with a handwritten note. "Please keep this on file in case you see them." Most of those letters went unanswered. One afternoon in August, Adler received a call from a sheriff's deputy in Mendocino County. A local woman claimed she'd seen a family matching the Graysons shopping at a roadside market off Highway 101. The woman said they seemed normal, polite, not in distress. When she waved at the little girl, the mother quickly turned her away. By the time deputies arrived, the family was gone. The market clerk remembered them only vaguely. They paid in cash, didn't talk much. The lead faded like the others before it. Yet Adler added a new note to the case summary. Possible travel corridor, northwestern California. Family moving frequently. As summer waned, even the parents stopped expecting answers. The house in Visalia was eventually sold to another family, its porch repainted, the swing removed. Only the neighbors remembered the way it used to creak on windy nights. In November 1994, Adler filed his final report, The document ran 4 pages, plain and formal. No indication of foul play. Subject family verified alive through photographic evidence and forensic confirmation. Case status: closed. He signed his name and set the file aside, though he didn't forget it. Few detectives ever do. Months later, around Christmas, a card arrived at the Fresno post office addressed again to Harold and Marion. The handwriting was the same neat script from the back of the Polaroid. Inside, a short message. "Merry Christmas, we're together. Don't worry." There was no signature, no address. The postmark this time read Billings, Montana. Harold showed it to no one but Adler. "They moved again," he said softly. The detective nodded. "They don't want to be found." After that, there were no more letters. The trail ended, and the Graysons, alive but unreachable, slipped quietly into the category of people who had chosen a different kind of disappearance, one without tragedy, without crime, but with a finality all its own. Years later, Adler would still keep the Polaroid in his desk drawer. Sometimes, when new recruits asked about the strangest case he'd ever worked, he'd pull it out and set it on the table. "They weren't running from the law," he would say. "They were running from their lives." Then he'd look at the photo again, at the 4 smiling faces under the hard western sun, and add in a lower voice, almost to himself, "I hope wherever they went, they finally found what they were looking for." By the spring of 1995, the name Grayson had faded from the daily vocabulary of Visalia. The new owners of the small house on North County Road had painted it pale yellow, planted roses along the fence, and taken down the faded missing family flyer that once hung on the telephone pole across the street. Children now rode their bikes past it again. To anyone new in town, it was just another house, ordinary and unremarkable. Only the older neighbors still looked twice when they passed, remembering the faces that had once waved from the porch. At the police station, the file labeled Grayson, Gabe et al. Missing sat on the second shelf of the records room. Its edges had softened from handling, its papers yellowing slightly under the fluorescent light. For Detective Paul Adler, closing the case had felt like ending a sentence that didn't have a period. Officially, the report said, "Subjects located. No criminal act. Case closed." But Adler never truly believed in that final word. Closed. It sounded tidy, and this case was anything but. Still, procedure was procedure. The department's missing persons log needed to be updated, and after the Polaroid and the Christmas card, there was no legal reason to keep it open. Families were allowed to start over if they chose, so long as no law was broken. Disappearing, after all, was not a crime. When Adler called Harold and Marion to tell them the file was being archived, the old man listened in silence. Then he said, "If you ever hear from them again, even by accident, promise you'll let me know." Adler hesitated, then answered, "I will." He meant it. That spring, Harold and Marion visited Visalia one last time before selling the empty plot they still owned near the old house. They drove slowly through town, recognizing little. The diner where Gabe and Nora used to take the kids after church had closed, replaced by a taco stand. The power company had a new sign out front. Only the road north, stretching toward the distant hills, looked the same way it had the day their son's truck disappeared down it. Back at the station, Adler kept one copy of the Polaroid for himself, tucked inside the last page of the file. He told no one. Sometimes, during late shifts, he would look at it again. The image had begun to fade around the edges, the blues turning gray, the paper curling slightly. But the 4 figures remained. Gabe with his hand resting lightly on Cyrus's shoulder, Nora standing close beside him, Ellie holding something in her hands. Maybe a drawing, maybe a folded note. They were smiling, but there was something careful about those smiles, as if they were aware that a camera could freeze a lie just as easily as it could capture a truth. Months turned into years. New cases came and went. Runaways, accidents, crimes with clear endings. But the Grayson disappearance lingered in Adler's memory like a page left unturned. Every so often, an old report or tip would surface. A sighting in Nevada, a rumor in Oregon, a letter forwarded from a post office in Idaho. Each one led nowhere. He learned not to chase them. In time, he began to think less about where they had gone, and more about why they had needed to go. In interviews with other detectives, Adler sometimes mentioned the case as an example of what he called the quiet exits, the ones that happen without violence, without panic, only the slow decision of people who no longer fit inside their own lives. Most missing persons, he'd say, are found because someone is still looking. The Graysons stopped being found the moment they stopped wanting to exist as the Graysons. Meanwhile, in Fresno, Harold kept the original Polaroid in a wooden frame on the mantel. He didn't talk about it much. Sometimes, when relatives visited, they mistook it for an old vacation photo. Marion never corrected them. "They're happy," she would say, and leave it at that. Every Christmas, Harold mailed a card to the last postmark they had, Billings, Montana. He never got a reply, but he continued the ritual year after year. Inside each envelope, he wrote the same short line: "We love you. No questions asked." By the late 1990s, Adler retired. When he cleaned out his desk, he found the Grayson file among the old case folders. Regulations required him to leave it behind, but he slipped the Polaroid into his coat pocket. "Just a reminder," he said when the clerk asked, "of what we can't always solve." In interviews years later, he recalled one detail that had haunted him: the last confirmed evidence of the family, the fingerprint on the payphone in Santa Rosa. It had been perfectly clear, recent, unshaken by time. "That print meant she wasn't running in fear," he said. "It meant she'd stopped to make a choice, to call, to reassure, and to vanish again. That's not panic, that's intention." By 2001, the Visalia Police Department digitized its old records. The Grayson file was scanned, labeled historical, no action required. Most of the younger officers had never even heard the name. For them, it was just an entry in a database, one of hundreds of families who had come and gone over the decades. But every now and then, someone new to the department would hear the story and ask about it. They'd find Adler's note in the final page of the report, written in his neat, slanted hand. They didn't vanish in darkness, they walked away in daylight. And under it, one last sentence: "If we ever find them, let them keep their peace." In Fresno, Harold passed away in 2003. Marion followed 3 years later. When relatives cleared the house, they found the Polaroid still on the mantel. The image had faded to soft gray, but the outlines of the 4 figures were still visible. On the back, in Marion's handwriting, she had added her own line beneath Nora's: "We're fine. Please don't look for us." We never stopped looking anyway. The photo was buried with them, folded into a small envelope. Visalia changed over the years. More traffic, new suburbs, old farms turned into shopping centers. People forgot about the Graysons. But now and then, a longtime resident would mention the story to newcomers. "You know that little house on North County Road? A family once vanished from there. No one ever found out why." They would tell it quietly, not as a tale of fear, but as something strange and human, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, lives can end not with tragedy, but with silence. And far away, in a small town somewhere north, a woman named Nora, or someone who had once been her, might still keep a Polaroid in a drawer, its edges worn, the ink faded, but the meaning intact. A message from the life they left behind. Proof that they were once real, once loved, once part of a place called Visalia. When a case ends without an ending, people begin to invent one. That's how the story of the Grayson family lived on after the file was closed. The official report said they were alive and free to stay missing. But Visalia, like any small town, couldn't leave it at that. Every few years, their names surfaced again in quiet conversations over coffee, in online message boards, in the dusty archives of true crime enthusiasts who refused to believe the simplest explanation, that a family could choose to disappear for no reason at all. The first theory was the one law enforcement had considered from the start: money. There were whispers that Gabe had been involved in something shady with the power company, a side contract gone bad, a debt that needed escaping. But when former co-workers were questioned years later, none could recall anything like that. Gabe was steady, punctual, cautious with money. His bank records, examined multiple times, showed no gambling, no large withdrawals beyond the final $8,000. The idea that he'd risk everything for a debt didn't match the man who once argued with a cashier over a missing dime in change. The second theory revolved around Nora. Some believed she'd grown restless, a quiet woman suffocating under small-town life, tempted by a fresh start somewhere far away. The Polaroid, some said, bore her mark more than Gabe's. Her handwriting, her choice of words. "We're fine. Please don't look for us." Those who favored this theory thought she had planned it carefully, emptied their savings, sold the truck, guided her husband and children into a new life. A mother protecting her family from something she couldn't explain. But protecting them from what? That question gave rise to the third, darker theory, the one that still lingers on late-night forums today, that they were running from someone. One rumor began when a former police dispatcher, long retired, claimed to remember an unlogged call the week before the family vanished. A woman, crying softly, had reported that someone keeps driving by our house at night. There was never any record of the call, and no proof it was Nora. But the story stuck, feeding a narrative of unseen danger. Perhaps someone from Gabe's work, or a stranger obsessed with Nora, or even an unrelated threat that happened to land on their doorstep. Still, Detective Adler never believed it. "If you're running in fear," he said once in an interview, "you don't take the time to make sure your house is neat and your checkbook balanced." Everything about the Graysons' exit spoke of planning, not panic. Another idea, strange but persistent, was religious isolation. Northern California and Southern Oregon were dotted with communes and spiritual retreats in the early 1990s. Some were harmless, others less so. The theory suggested that the Graysons had joined such a group under assumed names, perhaps drawn by promises of simplicity, community, or freedom from the modern world. It fit the era. A family tired of consumer life, turning toward something quieter, but no known community ever claimed them, and no census or record ever matched their descriptions. The fifth theory came from a retired psychologist who studied voluntary disappearances. He believed the Graysons were part of what he called silent exiles, people who, after personal crises or loss of meaning, choose to erase their identities without violence or fraud. To start over completely, he said, requires not just leaving your home, but leaving the people who know who you are. In his view, the Graysons were not hiding from danger or guilt. They were escaping the weight of being themselves. Most people dream of beginning again, he said. They were simply the ones who did it. Years after the case had gone cold, a local journalist named Linda Carver decided to revisit the story for a column on Visalia Mysteries. She interviewed neighbors, former co-workers, even Adler, who had long since retired. What struck her most was how ordinary everyone's memories were. No shouting, No strange visitors. No warnings, she wrote. Just a family that packed up and drove away one afternoon. Her article ended with a single line that echoed Adler's own thought. They didn't vanish in darkness. They left in daylight. But not everyone was satisfied with that calm conclusion. Online, the legend of the Graysons began to twist into folklore. A few claimed to have met a couple in Montana who matched their description. Others swore the photo was staged, that the family had never survived past 1993, that someone had sent the picture to mislead police. A video circulating years later claimed to analyze the Polaroid's shadows to prove it was taken somewhere else entirely. Utah, or maybe Wyoming. None of it ever led to proof. What persisted beneath all the speculation was the unease of what their disappearance said about ordinary life. The Graysons had everything people were supposed to want. Steady jobs, healthy kids, a small but decent home. If even they could walk away, what did that mean for the rest of the town, for the rest of us? That question made people uncomfortable. So they invented reasons. Reasons were easier than emptiness. When Adler was asked, near the end of his life, which theory he believed, he smiled slightly and said, "Maybe they just wanted peace." He'd seen too many cases end in violence, too many families destroyed by the very things they couldn't leave behind. The Graysons, in his view, had done something few have the courage to do. They'd turned off the lights, closed the door, and kept driving until the noise of the world was far behind them. He paused, then added, "The only thing that still bothers me is the child's eyes in that photograph. Ellie. She's smiling, but she's looking past the camera, like she already knows we'll never find her again." After that interview, the story drifted once more into memory. The theories multiplied, as they always do with mysteries that resist solution. But somewhere, in all the speculation, the truth likely remained small and simple, buried under layers of human need to explain what cannot be explained. Maybe they had debts. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they were simply tired. Or maybe, one April afternoon in 1993, Gabe looked at his wife. She looked back. And without a word, they both understood that life as they knew it had ended, and that the only way forward was to begin again, somewhere else, as someone else. No detective ever found proof of any crime, nor any evidence of regret. Just a photograph, a brief voice on a payphone, and the echo of an unanswered promise. Today, the Grayson file rests in the county archive, boxed under voluntary disappearance, 1990s. The label is neat, impersonal, the ink beginning to fade. But inside, between the official reports and evidence logs, there's still the Polaroid, the same smiling family under a hard white sky, the same message written in Nora's hand. "We're fine. Please don't look for us." It remains both explanation and riddle, 20 words that solved nothing and somehow ended everything. And maybe that's the only truth the Graysons ever meant to leave behind, that peace, for some, is found not in being discovered, but in being gone. The years that followed softened everything. Time has a way of sanding down even the sharpest edges of mystery, leaving only a faint outline, the shape of what once was. By the early 2000s, few in Visalia still spoke of the Grayson family. Their old house was torn down to make way for a new development. The oak tree out front was cut down. The address no longer existed, except in the records of the town's property office. Detective Paul Adler retired quietly and moved north to a cabin near Mount Shasta. He took little with him. A box of books, his service revolver, and the Polaroid. Sometimes, in the early morning light, he would set it by the window and watch the fog gather behind the image. They found their peace, he'd tell himself, though he never quite believed it. There was a small ache left behind, not grief, not failure, but something in between. In Fresno, the Graysons' daughter who had stayed behind, Ellie, grew into adulthood under a different name. She rarely spoke of her parents. When asked, she would say they had moved away a long time ago. Her words were simple, but her eyes carried something unresolved, like someone who knew more than she dared to say. Each year on April 10th, she lit a candle in her apartment window. She never explained why. For the neighbors who once saw Gabe mowing the lawn or Nora hanging laundry in the afternoon sun, the memory became more dream than fact. Some thought the family must have died somewhere far away. Others preferred to believe they were living quietly under new names, perhaps watching sunsets over another stretch of California hills. In 2010, long after Adler's passing, a local historian cleaning out the department archive came across the Grayson file. Most of the ink had faded, but the photograph was still there. He showed it to a young officer who said, "They look happy." The historian nodded. "Maybe they were," he said. "Or maybe they just wanted to look that way." The file was digitized, then sealed again. The case remained officially closed, but its questions lingered, not in courtrooms or police reports, but in the minds of those who remembered what it meant for a family to simply vanish without tragedy, without trace, without goodbye. There are stories that end with truth, and there are stories that end with silence. The Graysons belonged to the latter. No headlines, no arrests, no villains, just the soft hum of an unanswered question, carried through time. Some say that's the hardest kind of mystery, not one that can't be solved, but one that shouldn't be. And somewhere, in a quiet town with no connection to Visalia, a woman might still keep a single Polaroid tucked inside a book, its edges frayed, its colors almost gone. Maybe she takes it out sometimes when the house is still and the world feels far away. Maybe she looks at the faces frozen in sunlight and whispers a name she no longer uses. Maybe she remembers that once, long ago, they were the Graysons. The story of the Grayson family reminds us that not every mystery ends with answers. Some end with acceptance. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below and subscribe for more real cases that linger beyond the headlines. Because sometimes, the truth isn't lost. It's simply somewhere else, waiting to be found. Tell us where you watch from,